This is a Rancho crawler suspension system, but for the purposes of this video, it could be any 3 to 4 inch lift kit that comes complete with coils, shocks, adjustable control arms, track bars, and just about everything else that you'd need to clear a set of 37 to 38 inch tires. And I'm here to tell you that installing something like this is a lot easier than you would think. Plus, the money that you save from not having a shop install it for you will easily pay for all the tools that you need, and the knowledge that you gain is something that money just can't buy. Trust me, you can do this. And because I know it's coming, why Rancho instead of some other social media trendy brand? Well, mainly because I want to help people, not influence them. And I've run plenty of Rancho kits in the past and have always found that the products that they make are surprisingly nice. And I really like the fact that so much of it is still made right here in the USA. And the few parts that aren't are made in countries like Australia, South Korea, and even Poland, as in, not China. Last but not least, Rancho makes affordable products. And that means they're accessible to a whole lot more people and without having to empty every pocket. With that said, the first thing I'm gonna do to get things going is to set all the control arms to the length specified by Rancho. As you can see, their heavy-duty control arms are adjustable and come with their maintenance-free D2 bushings. And for this lower front control arm, it's going to need to be set to 24 3/8 of an inch center of mounting hole to center of mounting hole. So we'll take a quick measurement here, and I can see that it's already just 24 inches. And that means this is going to need to be spin out a bit. It's 24 1/8. 24 3/8. Set this aside. Now, these particular front upper control arms, they're made with adjustable ends on both sides and with the fork side having a left-hand thread. And this is done so that it can be adjustable once it's installed on the vehicle. Now, the length these need to be set to is 20 5/16 of an inch, but you're going to want to adjust them evenly so that there are enough threads on both sides to allow for those adjustments to happen. Okay. Okay, so the rear lowers will need to be set to 20 inches. Okay. And last but not least, the rear uppers will need to be set to 17 3/4 of an inch. All right, that should be all of them. And I should note that the lower control arms, these guys, they're designed to set the position of your axle, and so none of those settings are going to change. However, your front upper control arms, these guys, they control caster. And depending on whether or not you're going to actually want more or less, those adjustments will need to be made with these guys. And as I showed earlier, it can be all done while installed on the vehicle. Now, the rear upper control arms, these guys set pinion angle. And if you're running something like an aftermarket double cardan U-joint style drive shaft, you're going to need to set these guys to have your pinion angle in line with the drive shaft. While we're at it, let's get those track bars set as well. Okay, these need to be set to 34 and 7/16. So this thing is going to need to be pulled out a bit. Almost. Okay, 34 and 7/16. Okay. Okay, and the rear needs to be set to 37 and 5/8. Perfect. Okay. So once again, these settings for the track bars, they're just starting points. After your coils settle out, and depending on how much extra weight you have on your Jeep, additional adjustments may be needed to recenter your axles at ride height. So for those of you who haven't seen it before, this thing is our 392. And Cindy and I have had it for about a year now. And I gotta tell you, we absolutely love it. Just as is. And to the point where we seriously considered leaving it totally stock forever. Yeah. This is the JL Wrangler that we're gonna be installing our brand new Rancho lift kit on. And what you're about to see will be the same for any JL Wrangler. And the process will be similar, if not the same, for just about any lift kit out there that comes as complete as it. So before we get started on anything, it's always a good idea to be parked on a level surface to make sure that your parking brake is engaged. And because we're going to be starting on the front, to chock your rear wheels. With that out of the way, there are a few things that I like to disconnect with the full weight of the Jeep on the ground, and the first of which are the sway bar links. And to do that, I'm going to use an 18mm socket and wrench. Okay. Making that the passenger side has a double shear connection, all you have to do is remove the one bolt securing it to the axle. All right, now I'm going to disconnect the track bar from the axle, and for that I'm going to use a 21mm socket and a long extension. Obviously, I've got a lift, and I will be using it today. But for those of you who don't, you're going to need to use a floor jack to raise your Jeep from the axle and then set your frame rails down on the jack stand just behind the skid bar. All right, now the wheels can come off, and for that, we're gonna use a 22mm socket. With the wheels off, I'm gonna now take a floor jack and use it to support the weight of the axle. You don't actually wanna lift the axle so much so that your frame rails come off the jack stand, or in our case, the lift, just enough to support the weight of the axle. So for those of you with a Rubicon, this step is actually pretty important. You need to disconnect the wiring harness for the locker right where it connects to the back of the differential housing. And in order to do that, there's a locking tab on the back of the plug, and you can use a small screwdriver just to twist it out, and then squeeze down on it and pull out. Now, using a trim pry tool like this, we're going to separate the wiring harness from the upper control arm. Okay, finally, there's one more tab right here on the frame rail next to the engine mount, and we're going to want to disconnect that as well. Perfect. All right, obviously we have a 392, so we don't have an FAD. But if you still have an FAD, you're gonna need to do basically the same thing. Disconnect the wiring harness from the FAD unit, separate the wiring harness from the upper control arm and the frame rail as well. All right, now we can go ahead and remove the shocks, and we'll be needing an 18mm socket and wrench for that. All right, now using a 15mm socket, I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect the brake and ABS line brackets secured to the lower control arm. And now using a 10mm socket, I'm gonna remove the bolt securing the brake line bracket to the frame rail. And once again, I'm going to use the same 10mm socket to remove this bolt securing the brake line bracket to the lower spring perch. All right, everything's nice and slack. All these are things that I'm doing right now so that when we droop out the axle to remove the coils, nothing gets hung up. All right, now we just need to repeat on the other side. All right, there's one more thing I think I need to do. Grab my trim pry tool again. Let's see the axle breather. There's a tab right here on the frame rail. I'm just gonna pull that out and separate this here because that's definitely gonna pull out. Double check everything is loose. And now we can lower the front axle. As it's coming down, you wanna double check to make sure you didn't miss anything. Let it come down nice and slow. You don't want it hanging from any wires or anything else. We go all the way down. All right, I think that might be it. From here, all you need to do is push down on your axle a little bit, lift up your coil, pull it out. Same thing with the passenger side. Slip up, comes right out. Quickly, you and your soccer ball. All right, with the coils out, I'm now gonna go ahead and grab a couple jack stands and place the front axle on them. Time to swap out the control arms. And for that, I'm gonna use a 21mm socket and a 24mm wrench, and we're gonna start with the driver's side front lower. We're gonna replace these control arms one by one, and it's gonna be super easy now that the axle is resting on the jack stands. Place the 24mm wrench on the back, 21 on the front. Okay. All right. Now onto the frame side. Again, 24 on the back, 21 on the front. That's kind of new. All right, now to get a front lower control arm for the driver's side. And I believe this is it. We want the adjustable end to go on the frame mount. We want Rancho reading correctly. Plus this bow right here is for tire clearance. So let's take this, let's slip it up and in, factory hardware. Now, I have to point out on our 392, there was this washer that was on the back of this bracket. I haven't actually seen this on other JLs before, but since we have it, I'm gonna reinstall it. So everything's being just loosely installed right now. Now we're gonna go to the axle mount. As you can see here, the holes aren't exactly lining up. A little bit off, so I'm gonna go ahead and take a reaming tool like this, see if I can't help it along. Almost. There we go. Let's see if I can get that bolted. All right. Oh, that's just about there now. Take a hammer and just tap it through. All right. Let's go ahead and tighten these up. All right, so if these control arms had bonded rubber bushing, clevi bushings like you would see from a factory control arm, and a lot of kits actually use, you would really need to wait till the full weight of the Jeep was on the ground before you tightened up those bolts to torque spec. But being that these are D2 bushings that Rancho makes, they're basically dual durometer bushings, and because they're not bonded rubber, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten them now. And these bolts need to be tightened to 190 foot-pounds of torque. It's kind of a large amount, really. Oh, jeez. All right, I'm not gonna lie, that was actually kind of a pain, especially working this low to the ground and working with a big torque wrench, but I was able to finally get them on. Now I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up the jam nut, and that needs to be set to 150 foot-pounds of torque. 150. And then you're gonna wanna use something like this. This is called a crow's foot, and it's a 1.5 inch crow's foot, and you can see fits right on the jam nut. So pop this guy on. Okay. Moving on to the upper control arms, you're gonna need a 10mm socket, and it's pretty helpful to have something like a 10mm gear wrench to remove the two bolts securing the heat shield to the upper control arm mount on the frame rail. All right, now using an 18mm socket, I'm gonna remove the bolt securing the upper control arm to the frame. All right, and now using the same 18mm socket, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the bolt securing the control arm to the axle. All right, now to install our new upper control arms. And both of these are exactly the same, so you just need to grab one and then install it on our Jeep using the factory hardware. Okay. Okay. All right, so we can see that we're a little bit off right there, which is fine. So we're going to use a little trick here. Take our floor jack, place it underneath the pinion, and then we're just going to raise it up a bit until the holes line up. Great. Pop that in. Secured in place. All right, now we can go ahead and tighten the frame side bolt to 80 foot-pounds of torque, being that the Rancho arms use D2 bushings. But on the axle end, being that the factory bushings are Cleveite or bonded rubber, we're gonna have to wait till the full weight of the Jeep is on the ground before we can tighten that up. All right, just like before, these jam nuts are going to need to be tightened to 150 foot-pounds. Okay. Now the heat shield can get reinstalled. Now for the other side. Oh no. Okay, so being that we have a 392, the space between the exhaust and the upper control arm bolt is really tight, and I can't get a socket or otherwise on there, so I'm gonna get a little tricky. Use an 18mm box wrench and a helper wrench and cheat a little. See if we can't get this other bolt out first and give us a little more wiggle room. Whew, got it out. So, being that we don't have a whole lot of room to work with, we are once again going to rely on a crow's foot to get us to the 80 foot-pounds of torque that we need. Okay. Getting close. I think now what we need to do is grab a screwdriver and remove the lower spring perch isolators. So we're going to grab these new Rancho ones, install them. There's a peg, there's a hole right here, line that. Same thing, there's a peg right here, hole right here, line it up, pop that on. Now we're gonna get our floor jack again, raise the axle just a bit. Pull out the jack stands. Okay, from here, what we need to do is lower the axle all the way down. Okay. And this is where the fun really begins. As you can see, the new coils are really tall. And the space between the lower and upper spring perch isn't a whole lot. You can see it's going to be very difficult to get this coil in. Now, a set of spring compressors will help you to compress the length of these coils and help you get them in, but there are tricks to help get these in without them. So by lifting up the passenger side of the axle, it's forced the driver's side to droop out a lot more. And as you can see, we're practically there. Just a little bit of effort will be needed to get it in from here. But first, I'm going to grab a bump stop extension. Grab some hardware, slip it in. Perfect. Before we can install these, we need to make sure that the upper spring perch rubber isolator, where these nipples are, go into the holes up on top. It looks like it will. So I'll drop that down, take the coil, start sliding it up, grab the bump stop, slip it underneath. There we go. All right, the coil's in, and I just need to rotate it. There we go. Okay, just need to rotate it over so that the end of the coil terminates at the end of the isolator. Perfect. Okay, so now we just need to fish the bolt through the hole in the axle. And then we can take the washer and nylock provided. So we're going to fish this nylock and washer underneath. Okay, now we're going to take a 9/16 inch socket with an extension, drop it in through the coils. Get that thing started. Okay. And then using a 9/16 inch wrench to hold it on the bottom, take our ratchet, slip between the coils, and tighten it in place. Okay. Now we're talking. Let's lower this side down a bit. Not all the way down because we're going to eventually install the shocks, but I need to check all the lines to make sure everything's still going to clear. So this is the brake line. Okay, you can see the breather hose is a little bit tight right there. So let's kind of scoot that guy up a bit. Just move up the zip tie connection just to give the breather a little bit more slack. Let's try that again. Still pretty tight. That's a little better. Take our 10mm socket and secure the brake line and ABS lines to the frame rail. Reinstall this clip here. Okay, these all look pretty good too. Slip that in. All right, shock time. I think this might be it. All right, so this is clearly the shorter of the two, so this has got to be the front shock. Okay, so we're more than at full droop, so good. Let's take the jack, raise it up just enough to get the holes lined up. All right, using an 18mm wrench, in this case a gear wrench, just to make things easier, we can go ahead and tighten up that upper bolt. Okay, now that bolt can be tightened up to 80 foot-pounds of torque. Once again, using an 18mm socket and wrench, I'm going to go ahead and tighten up this lower bolt. And then that bolt's going to get tightened to 75 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. So this bracket right here for the ABS line and the brake line, there are a lot of kits that actually have a provision where you can bolt this back onto it. Me personally, I just like to cut the things off so that I have a lot more looseness in the brake lines. Clearly it's still attached to the lower spring perch and on the frame rails, but for our purposes today, I'm just going to go ahead and zip tie this thing on. All right, now we can go ahead and plug our locker back in, lock it in place. And if your Jeep has an FAD, you're gonna need to get that plugged in as well. Now we're gonna move over to the sway bar and we're gonna lower this arm down and disconnect the links. And to do that, we're gonna use a 6mm Allen wrench and an 18mm gear wrench. First, you're going to put the gear wrench on the nut, and then you're going to place the 6mm Allen wrench in the center. And then you can remove the nut. All right, now we can grab our new front links that are longer. And these nuts, pretty sure is 19mm. Yep. Let's flip this over and make it easier. Once again, we're going to place our gear wrench on the nut. 6mm Allen wrench in the center of the stud. Now that the nut is actually tightened, I don't think we need the Allen wrench anymore, but that nut's going to need to be tightened to 60 foot-pounds of torque. Perfect. Okay. And then the factory hardware can be used to secure the axle end in place. Now using an 18mm socket and wrench, we can tighten this up a bit. And then as before, use our torque wrench to tighten up those bolts to 60 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, and then as before, you can tighten this up to 60 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. All right, now using a really long extension and a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench, we're going to remove the factory track bar from the frame mount. We got our new track bar. We want to just kind of place it on the axle mount. Get the frame side mount in. Use the factory hardware to secure it in place. And then, using our 21mm socket and wrench, tighten it on. I'm going to set this to 120 foot-pounds of torque. That takes care of the frame side mount of the track bar. And as far as the axle end goes, we're going to need to wait till the wheels are back on and the full weight of the Jeep is on the ground. In fact, if we were installing this lift using a floor jack and a pair of jack stands, that's what we would be doing next. But since we're doing this whole lift on our lift, we're going to head over to the back now. Now, if you are using a floor jack and a pair of jack stands to install your lift, the first thing you're going to want to do here is to shift your transfer case into four-wheel drive. And then you're going to take the wheel tracks that were in the rear and put them on your front tires. And then we're going to grab our 21mm socket and we're going to remove the bolt securing the rear track bar to the axle. Now, using an 18mm socket and wrench, we're going to disconnect the sway bar links from the axle. Once again, if you're installing this lift using a floor jack and jack stands, now is the time to raise the rear end of your Jeep from the axle and then set the frame rails down on a pair of jack stands. As you can see here, where you would want to put your jack stands is just in front of the lower control arms, just like we are doing with our lift. Using our 22mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove the lug nuts, securing our wheels in place. All right, we want to double check to make sure that the weight of the axle is being supported by the floor jack. And then we're going to unplug the locker wiring harness from the differential. And to do that, we're just going to unlock this gray tab by taking a screwdriver and gently twisting on it. And then we're going to squeeze on the plug and pull it out. And then we're going to separate it from this stud right here, just to make sure there's enough slack and everything. And because I know we're gonna get a lot more droop with our new suspension, I'm gonna separate the wiring harness from the cross member as well, just to give it a little bit more slack. Now it's time to start working on the parking brake cables. And for that, I'm gonna use a 13mm socket and a long extension like this to remove the bolt securing the clamp on the bottom of the tub. Oh, and for this part, you're gonna need to make sure that the parking brake is disengaged. Okay, now we need to disconnect the parking brake cables from the backs of the drums. And before we do that, I'm gonna take some duct tape and apply it to the cable itself, just to help prevent it from getting sucked in and pulled through the outer part of the cable housing. If that happens, the mechanism underneath the center console could separate from the cable, and that is not good. So that ought to help right there. Okay, now we're gonna separate the cable from the hook on the back of the drum, and for that we're gonna use a pair of vice grips and a small pry bar. What we're gonna do is grab that hook, place the pry bar in between here. We're gonna twist with the vice grips and twist with the pry bar. There we go. All right, now we're gonna separate the parking brake cable from the retainer, securing it to the axle tube. And to do that, we're gonna use needle nose vice grips, and we're just gonna press these tabs in right here and try to work it through. Okay. Okay, so now we're just gonna separate these clips, securing the locker wiring harness to the emergency brake cable. And then we're gonna reroute these cables up and through the cross member and bring them down the other side. That's one. That's two. Okay, for now we're just gonna leave these dangling. They're gonna help us give us the slack we need so that we can get all the droop necessary to install a new set of coils. Okay, now we're gonna grab an 8mm socket and remove the 3 screws securing this inner fender liner piece to the back of the rear bumper. that should give us access to the upper shock bolt. But first, let's get the other side. Okay, so there is actually one other thing that I need to take care of first before we get to the shocks, and that is to remove these brackets securing the ABS line and brake line to the upper control arm mounts. And for that, I'll be using a 13mm socket. Now, you can get our 18mm socket and wrench, and then disconnect the shocks from the axle mounts. Now for the upper bolts. Using a long extension, a swivel, and an 18mm socket again, these can come out now. Okay. Now, we're going to lower the axle slowly, making sure that nothing's hanging up and that we didn't miss anything. And then carefully remove the coils as they come out. Okay, looks like the coils are free. Before I go any further, just falls right out. Need to go a little bit more for the passenger side. Comes right out. Perfect. All right. Time to get our axles sitting on a pair of jack stands. Raise this up a bit. And now for the control arms. Starting with the driver's side lower, which you can tell this is driver's side because you can see the Rancho is reading correctly. The adjustable end will go on the frame end. Let's grab this thing. To remove the factory lower control arms, we're going to need a 21mm socket and wrench. Now we can put on the new Rancho control arm. Again, with the adjustable end going to the frame mount. Slide this up into the axle end. Looks like we'll need to make a little bit of an adjustment. Grab my reaming tool. There we go. Before I go crazy, I'm going to put the passenger side on as well. Perfect. As I mentioned up front, if you're working with new control arms that have bonded rubber bushings, Clevite bushings, like what you see on a factory arm, you would need to wait till the full weight of this Jeep is on the ground to tighten up these bolts to torque spec. But again, the Rancho arms come with D2 bushings, so I'm gonna go ahead and start tightening them up now. So all these bolts need to be tightened to 90 foot-pounds of torque. Now, time for the jam nuts. Once again, using a 1.5-inch crow's foot, we're going to tighten up these jam nuts to 150 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. Now, time for the uppers. Okay, going to grab my impact, a 21mm socket, and a long extension. Now these upper control arms, they're held in place with a bolt and a flag nut, so the socket is all that we're going to need. Same goes for the axle mount. Has a flag nut right here. So all we're going to need to do is remove this bolt. So now we're going to make sure we have the correct upper control arm, and you can tell that this is the driver's side because it has the adjustable end that goes on the frame mount, and this final curve goes toward the axle. So we're going to slip this side in, begin to thread it through, and then there's this flag nut. On the back side of the frame rail, there is actually a porthole that you can use to help guide it in. We're going to slide this up and in. Okay, now for the axle mount. And as you can see here, it's kind of off by a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my floor jack. I'm going to place it underneath the pinion. Okay, that looks pretty lined up now. Easy as that. All right, so to be fair, this side is kind of a pain, and mainly because the gas tank is in the way and it prevents you from seeing this flag nut going into the hole using the porthole on the other side. So what I'd like to do is to actually get this situated and kind of install it on the axle end first. Just enough to kind of get it held up in place. Just get started a little bit. Take the flag nut. Gonna have to look for it. Oh, looks like I got it. Perfect. I got super lucky. Okay. Okay, as before, I'm going to take my 21mm socket and get these on a bit. Okay, now we're going to take our torque wrench and set it to 120 foot-pounds of torque, and that's what we're going to tighten up the frame side mount bolts to. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to set our torque wrench to 95 foot-pounds of torque, as that's what the lower mounts are going to need. Okay, gonna grab our crow's foot again, set this thing to 150. Okay. Now we're going to take the jack stands out from underneath the axle. And then we're going to lower it as far as it'll go. Okay, time for the coils. So I got lucky in that the rubber isolator on the upper spring perch stayed in place. Had it fallen out, you would have needed to make sure that it went back in with the nipples going through the mount itself, or the perch itself, excuse me. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to make sure that the spring, where it terminates, ends right where it terminates on the isolator. You can see right here. Grab the coil, place it on the axle, and then we're gonna use our floor jack. And it has a lot of droop. Just to get it positioned in there. Make sure it's terminating correctly right at the isolator. And then we're gonna work on the passenger side. But first, I'm gonna get a jack stand. Pump this up a bit. Okay. With the jack stand in place, I can work on the passenger side without having to worry about the coil falling out. Now here's the real problem. As you can see here, the upper spring perch rubber isolator had fallen out of the perch. And unfortunately, it needs to go in a very specific way with this nipple going through a hole on the bottom of it. As you can kind of see here, there's the hole, and there's really nothing to keep it up there. So there's a trick that you can use, and that is spray mount. 3M makes a brand called Super 77. This is made by Loctite. I'm just gonna give it a quick hit where it needs to go. And then, while that's kind of drying, I'm gonna hit the perch as well. We're gonna let that set up for about a minute, and then we'll install it. All right, so now that's been setting up for about a minute. I'm gonna go ahead, find that hole, stick it in, and press it on. Look at that. Easy as that. All right, now we can grab our coil. Locate where it needs to be indexed. Back over here. Now we're going to make sure it terminates in the same way. And just to help make sure everything stays in place, I'm going to raise the axle just a bit so that it's level with the other side. Okay. Now, we're going to grab our 13mm socket and reinstall the brake line bracket onto the upper control arm. Mount, that is. This is going to be for the parking brake relocation. As you remember, we rerouted them underneath the cross member, and this bracket is going to help secure them in place. All right, so using the provided hardware, I'm going to slip it into the bracket and then thread it into the cross member, and then using a 19mm socket, secure it in place. And then reusing the factory clamp and hardware, plus the additional washer and nut, I'm going to strap this up to the bracket. All right, now using a 13mm wrench to hold the nut in place, you can use a 13mm socket to secure everything in place. Now we're going to go ahead and take the parking brake cables and reconnect it onto the retainer right here on the axle tube by slipping it in and then just pulling it through so that those tabs connect. And then the fun part, trying to get this thing reconnected onto the back of the drum. So I'm going to use a couple of vice grips. One to kind of hold this tab and pull it out as far as I can. And then another to hold the hook. Okay. And hook it in. Whew, that's kind of a pain. So we can go ahead and cut off this duct tape now. Okay. And once again, we're going to slip it through, pull it in place, grab this guy, pull out. Even in the best of conditions, reconnecting your parking brake cable to the back of the drum can be somewhat of a challenge. And if you're finding it near impossible to get yours on, here is a pro tip. All right, the first thing you're gonna need to do is slide your seat all the way back and then use a small screwdriver to remove the 4 covers on the base of your center console. This forward. And then you're going to use a 10mm socket to remove the bolts securing it in place. With the bolts out, we're going to slide our front seats forward. And then using something like 2x4s or something about this size to help prop things up while you work, you can grab your center console, lift up, just kind of prop it up, and put one on the other side as well. And then we're going to adjust the parking brake cables. As you can see, these 2 things are your parking brake cables. And they're connected to a balancer with a stud right in the middle that's attached to the actual lever. Now this nut needs to be backed out counterclockwise, maybe 3-4 turns, and you'll need a 10mm socket to do that. All right. Now you're going to want to go back out and try to reconnect your parking brake to the back of the drum. And if you find that it's still too tight, you can always come back and make an additional adjustment. Now, the only thing that you need to be aware of is that you don't want it so loose that the cable just falls out. You actually want it to be somewhat tight and difficult to get in. All right, now it's time to remove the factory track bar. And for that, I'm going to use a 21mm socket and wrench. Our new track bar, just like the factory, we have the bend coming down here, and we're going to install the adjustable side up on the frame. And once again, since these are D2 bushings, we can just go ahead and zip it on now. Take my torque wrench, set it to 120 foot-pounds of torque. Just for good keeping, I'm going to put the factory hardware back in. And you can see this worked. Levi bushings, this track bar would just be hanging in the air, but you can see it falls right down. Let's put that there for safekeeping. Okay, time for the sway bar links. I'm going to grab my 18mm gear wrench and 6mm Allen wrench, just like before. Place our gear wrench on, Allen wrench, grab our new ones, and as before, a 19mm gear wrench is needed for this. All right, now setting my torque wrench back to 60 foot-pounds of torque. You can go ahead and tighten up these nuts. And then using the factory hardware, you can secure it to the axle mounts using an 18mm socket and wrench. And then once again, setting our torque wrench to 60 foot-pounds of torque, we can tighten these in place. Time for the bump stop extensions. Rancho provides all the hardware you need for it. And for this, we're going to need a 13mm wrench and a 13mm gear wrench. It'll help speed things along. Finally, the shocks. All right, so we're gonna use the factory hardware. The long bolt goes up on top. Slip that through. Right now, I'm gonna grab my 18mm socket and 18mm wrench, some dikes, cut the strap. Now we need to take our torque wrench, and the upper bolts are going to need to be tightened to 80 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. Okay, and then the lower mounts are going to need to be tightened to 75 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so now we can reconnect the locker, lock it in place, put this stud in. I don't know, I think I might actually cut these guys off and let it be loose so that we can get full droop without it getting all bound up. Okay, let's get this up a little bit higher. Get the wheels back on. Moment of truth. Now that looks silly. Oh my goodness. This is easily like 3.5 inches of lift with stock tires. That's ridiculous. Fortunately, we have an answer for that coming. Okay, there's still a couple more things we need to do. We need to get the track bars installed, the jam nuts tightened up, everything torqued up on them. And then I think we're good to go, minus a set of new shoes. So before I forget, I'm gonna make sure that I've got all the lug nuts tightened to 130 foot-pounds of torque. Right, now it's time for the track bars. We're getting super close to being done. Start with the rear. You can see that we're quite a bit off. And this whole track bar is gonna need to come over toward the driver's side by like an inch. So in order to do that, I'm gonna have Cindy come on the passenger side of the Jeep and give it a push, and that should do it. Okay, push. More. Keep going. Okay. Keep going if you can. Okay, got it. Thanks. Okay, let's put this nut on here. Now we gotta tighten that up to 120 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. Now using 1 3/8 of an inch crow's foot, we're gonna set this to 150 foot-pounds of torque. Let's get this jam nut tightened up. Okay, time for the front. Let's see. All right, you can see the front is kind of a tight fit, so I'm gonna tap it in. Super close, it's almost on. And see, it's only about a 1/4 inch off. And from here, I can have Cindy turn the steering wheel, and that'll actually draw that hole closer together. The other direction. Wait, too much. Right there. Can you actually jiggle it a little bit? There you go, thank you. Now we can tighten it up using a 21mm socket. And we'll use a torque wrench to make sure it's on at 120 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, now we gotta get this jam nut, set it to 150. All right, last but not least, we need to take care of those upper control arms on the front axle. And for that, we're gonna need our 18mm socket and possibly the wrench as well. And those bolts will need to be tightened to 80 foot-pounds of torque. Now this side. Okay. All right, and for the most part, that's all there is to it. But there is one other thing. As you can see, the steering wheel is pretty off center. And that's because we've lifted this Jeep and it's a solid front axle with a drag link and tie rod that steers the whole thing. But fortunately, there is an easy fix, and all you need is a 15mm wrench. This is the drag link adjuster, and this clamp is being secured in place by this nut. I'm going to use the 15mm wrench now to loosen it up. Okay. Now if I rotate this thing upwards, it'll turn the steering wheel to the left. If I rotate it downwards, it'll rotate it to the right. So I'm going to have Cindy keep an eye on the steering wheel as I rotate this adjuster until we have our steering wheel centered again.
Okay.
Is it going the right direction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going.
I'm going.
You're getting close now.
Okay.
A little bit more. A little bit more. A little bit more. Stop.
Okay. All right, now we can go ahead and tighten this nut again. Okay, and I'm actually gonna hang on to this wrench because there's a good chance that we didn't get the steering wheel perfectly centered. It's not unusual for it to take maybe 2 to 3 times to get it perfect, and the way you'll find out for sure is by driving it around. Now, the reason why it's so important to get that steering wheel dead centered is that if it's off, the computer will think you're in a slide, and that'll kick off the traction control system. So fortunately, it's an easy fix, but again, it may take more than one try. So that's all there is to it. And I guarantee it's something you can totally do. For our purposes, all we need to finish this thing up is a set of wheels and tires, and that is something you'll get to see in our next video. Like skinny jeans. Wow, that looks funny. But we've got an answer to it. Look what we have here. Let's go to the back tire. Now that will look a lot better.